welcome to our session, and a particularly warm welcome to our guest, Ed Miliband. He doesn't need a great deal of introduction, but I'll just recap a little bit. Ed is he's the Labour Party spokesman on climate change and net zero. He's a senior member of the Shadow Cabinet. He's, of course, a former leader of the Labour Party from 2010 to 2015. And he knows about government and about negotiating international deals from the inside, because between 2008 and 2010, he was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change under Gordon Brown. And that meant he attended the Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen 2009. And I remember a number of people at the time crediting him with saving that event from disaster. So he's the ideal guest on all these issues. The only chink in his green armour that I managed to find was in an interview recently where he revealed that he reached the age of 50 before he managed to
ride a bike.
But he now...
I'm a convert.
Even this skill he's now over...
I rode my bike here. I just want to put that on the record.
I saw the cycle helmet.
Exactly.
So
I could have just brought the cycle helmet and not ridden the
well,
bike,
actually,
but I promise you, I promise you, I did ride the bike too.
It's true, I didn't see the cycle. So maybe we should just start. We've got about 30 minutes. We'll have some questions towards the end of that time slot, so think about what you might want to ask. Perhaps we can start with the issue that nobody was thinking about, for obvious reasons, at COP26 in Glasgow, and everybody is thinking about now.
Yeah.
Ukraine. Clearly Russia's invasion was a disaster from a humanitarian and many other perspectives. The world changed in February, but I'm wondering how you think it's changed the debate on climate change, and whether it's all just unmitigated bad news, or whether there are perhaps some opportunities we can leverage from the repercussions of that.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and I just want to sort of put on record that I'm a New York Times subscriber, and thank you very much. And not just for the cooking app, I hasten to add, although I really like the cooking app, just to also put that on the record. No, your climate coverage in particular is excellent, as well as your British political coverage, of course. I mean, it feels like we're at every moment is a pivotal moment on climate. In this decisive decade and indeed in the years ahead. But it feels like politicians around the world have a big choice to make, which is, do they draw what I would call the right lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is, so long as you are exposed to fossil fuels, you are at the mercy of geopolitical events. You are at the mercy of petrostates, dictators, barbaric actions like the ones we've seen from Putin, and that the cheapest, cleanest, quickest, most secure way through is to double down on what I call a green energy sprint. Just to talk about the UK for a moment, I mean, it is such a no-brainer, this. I think on current levels, the price of onshore wind, for example, is about a quarter of the price of gas. So, we should be going hell for leather towards renewable energy of different kinds. We've done some on offshore wind, but not in some other areas. And the lessons, and I think there are similar lessons around the world. Now, having said that, of course, if you are, I was in the US recently, if you have your own sort of energy market, which we don't because we're a part of an integrated European market, the temptation is to kind of have a both-and strategy, which is to also, double down on fossil fuels, or at least to keep going in terms of fossil fuels. I mean, personally, we want to, and I would want to encourage as many countries in the world as possible to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible for all the reasons that we know about. But I think you're right to say that, as well as the obvious kind of global political implications for security and so on, I think it feels like a pivotal moment in terms of the decisions countries make.
And in terms of the international picture, I mean, climate change, almost by definition, requires international cooperation. I mean, Russia clearly not at the table at the moment.
Sure.
Tensions with China. The US is back at the table, at least for now. We saw the Supreme Court judgment recently on the European Environmental Protection Agency. Britain bickering with the EU on various things. How do you assess the sort of prospects for meaningful international collaboration at this particular moment, though?
I mean, look, I don't want to be a gloomster in this, but, you know, I thought Glasgow was modest progress, but a lot hinged on the clause in Glasgow that said countries will come back within the year to upgrade their nationally determined contributions, because we know what the world's objective is, which is to halve global emissions by 2030 in order to keep on track, or to be on any kind of track for 1.5 degrees. It feels at the moment like Glasgow might be the high point, not the sort of, not the starter. You know, it's good news in terms of Australia, because that is a major emitter that is back at the table and back in the game. I think, honestly, the American situation is... I'll say two things about this. One, the American situation is worrying. The cumulative effects of Joe Biden not being able to get Build Back Better through, and the Supreme Court decision, you know, I think it's okay to say this. I was at Glasgow and I met my old friend Xi Jinping, the Chinese climate envoy. He was the minister when I was there. And in my conversation with him, you know, he says, well, what about the US? You know, he didn't say, are they a reliable partner? But that's what he was trying to say to me. And, you know, if you look at the pattern, I'll just be honest about this, if you look at the pattern of events from sort of Kyoto onwards, you can see why countries that want to say, oh, can we really rely on the US to deliver, have got real doubts about the US's ability to deliver. And so, you know, I think it's desperately important that President Biden gets something through, either through executive action or legislative action, something more than what he's already got in the infrastructure bill. So that is, in a way, the gloomy news. I think there's one other thing, though, which I was saying to you earlier before we came on stage, which is, whereas 10 years ago, I would have said, well, look, it's so important that every country is at the table. And, of course, it still is important that every country is at the table. I think if you think about the UK for a moment, a country like the UK, we're not going to cease to act because the US has stalled. Because it makes economic sense. You know, we face three crises: an energy security crisis, a cost of living crisis, and the climate crisis. And we're doing this for all three reasons. The actions I'm talking about, whether it's renewable energy or energy efficiency or all those things, and that's because the fundamental difference from a decade ago when I was a climate change secretary is that the economics has changed. And the economics is for us. When I say us, the people in this room who I assume sort of care about this issue. And, you know, there's this report came out from the UK's Climate Change Committee this week, which is the body that I set up in 2008 to monitor and be a watchdog for government. And I strongly recommend its bedtime reading, 619 pages, their assessment. And on page, I think it's, I'm afraid I didn't get to this in the first reading, but on page 450-something, I got to page 400 the night before it came out, there's this fascinating fact, which it says, actually, if gas prices were to stay at current levels, the 1% of GDP cost that they estimated for the climate transition to 2035 in the UK becomes 0.5% of GDP saving. So the fact that we've got to this point where there's a sort of question about whether the climate transition actually costs or saves money, I think is, you know, a sign that I think countries will move ahead, sort of. The countries that have the political will to do so will move ahead anyway. I don't think they'll sort of stop moving because they'll say, oh, other countries aren't moving.
I mean, you mentioned that report, but I mean, actually, it wasn't hugely positive about the British government's
no, I tend to agree with them about that.
I mean, it sort of suggested we're basically going to miss our target.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't there a danger that the British climate protection push sort of peters out as we experiment with fracking, we extract a bit more from the North Sea, you know, perhaps, you know, cut fuel duties to...
I mean, You make a very good case for a change of government, Stephen. Which I know you're an objective journalist, so you weren't deliberately making that case. I mean, yes, that is a danger. I mean, if I can sort of be fair to the current government for a second, what the Climate Change Committee says is that they've set relatively ambitious targets by international standards, which is true. The problem is that they've got no plan to meet them. And it's very interesting, this, because I think it does speak to the whole debate in the US around Build Back Better and what gets through. For me, what is the big Achilles, the potential Achilles heel for those who care about this climate transition? It's not the economics anymore, because the economics is right. It's not business, by the way. I want to just mention this because I think one massive change from 10 years ago is the leadership shown by business. Business is actually ahead of government in the UK. Because business wants us to go further, faster, do more. I actually think the potential Achilles heel is whether this transition is fair to people. And I think that the green movement, if I can put it that way in broad sense, has not paid enough attention to this question. Now, what is the answer? So in the UK, this is, if you're going to change, if you're not going to have a gas boiler and you're going to have a heat pump, is it going to cost you more money? If you're going to have an electric car sales are up significantly in the UK, but is it just going to be a preserve of the rich, or is it going to be for, what Americans would call middle class people, lower middle income people in British parlance? Now, the answer to that for me is government has to collectivise some of these costs. So we've got this big climate investment pledge, £28 billion a year, public expenditure, which is about 1% of GDP. And the key sort of point of that is to sort of make this and this is what I'm working on in the Shadow Cabinet, is to make this transition fair. Because and I think there is a sort of, we have a consensus in this country on the need for climate action, but we have a divergence when it comes to, is this best done more or less leaving it to the individuals in the market with a bit of government on the side, or is this a much more of a partnership with government taking a lead with the private sector in making this transition happen and making it fair?
Yeah. So where do you think the public is at the moment? I mean, how can you bring the public along?
The public is totally with us.
But this winter, I mean, there may be people who have to choose between heating and eating. I mean, it's going to be,
But that's so important.
Fuel, but energy prices are doubling.
But that's such an important point, you see, because, and I'm sorry, I should have said this, spelt this out. Yes, and that's terrible. The answer, if we actually got the renewables projects which are stuck in the ludicrous planning system that we have, it would actually cut bills for people. If we insulated homes and had energy efficiency, it would cut bills for people. You see, I think this is why it's such a different debate. And when Nigel Farage, who I'm sure New York Times readers will know about, and other people say, well, this net zero thing, it's massively costly for people. I mean, they're just plain wrong. I mean, there's not a debate about this. When gas prices are 4 times renewable prices, it's just not a sort of question. And so they've got this net zero scrutiny group. They want it to be the next Brexit and so on. It's just, I don't believe it'll get off the ground because it is so, I mean, it's just so, and I actually think the public, and this is different from where the Brexit thing was, the public get this. If you look at the polling on, do we want fracking, do we want renewables? Renewables win by a mile. But people are asking, okay, overall, we see that it's the sensible way to go, but how's it going to affect me and my family? And that's the role of government.
Okay. I mean, talk a little bit about the Labour Party. I mean, I guess your critics would say a lot of the problems that this country has are long-run problems. I mean, the Labour government could have done a big home insulation programme if it had wanted to. When you look back, do you have regrets? And how and why would it be different next time?
Always.
Why would it be different next time with Labour, if
look,
there is a Labour?
I was the Climate Change Secretary in 2008 to 2010. We passed the World-Leading Climate Change Act, which has been emulated by some countries around the world, and that was crucial in putting in place a law, and this is sort of interesting, a law saying we must cut carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, now net zero, thanks to Theresa May, and I think it was very important that she did that. That was good, and we set up an institutional framework. And I would say actually one lesson for other countries, this institutional framework does make a difference. I made a joke about the 619-page report. I think this government would be worse on climate if it wasn't for this climate change committee scrutiny system, the whole notion of carbon budgets.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm thinking about what a new department will look like, because if Labour comes to power, we'll have a new climate change and net zero department. And what are the things that I think that it has to do that we didn't do in 2008, 2010? One, it's got to be the whole of government, not just some part of government. And what is the truth about the UK? It's been good on the power sector. It's been much less good at every other sector. Transport's getting a bit better, but that's what the CCC says. So you've got to have institutions in government where every department feels like it is a climate department, and they're held to account, and the Treasury is absolutely crucial in this. Because unless your finance department kind of integrates this into its, so it's public expenditure and carbon, I don't think you're going to succeed. It can't just be left to environment ministries. It's the first thing. Sort of secondly, obviously, the science is telling us we've got to go much, much further and much, much faster. And so that's what I would hope to do in government. But there's a third point also, which I think is relevant and maybe important, and it struck me from the US, which is, I think the movement outside government is also important. I mean, I know it's an odd thing for a politician to say, and odd in this room, but of course, politics is crucial to this to the change we need. But I think the Green New Deal movement in the US, and okay, they're struggling to get legislation through, has had an effect on where the center of gravity of the Biden administration is. So I think there's a sort of combination of forces that you need to make this change happen. You need government doing its bit. It's got to be a whole of government effort. You need the investment, but also the strength of this outside movement matters too.
Mm-hmm. And the £28 billion a year, I mean, incidentally already was announced because borrowing costs have gone up. I mean, is that
totally the right thing to do?
Certain, however, the high interest rates?
So it's totally the right thing to do. There's a very important report from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is our economic and financial watchdog in this country, which says delaying climate action by a decade doubles the cost. If you lock in high carbon choices for the reasons that I've set out earlier around the economics, you increase the cost. I'll give you a very concrete example of this, literally, which is that in 2016, if it had been in power in 2016, the Labour government would have said all new homes must be zero carbon homes. This government got rid of it. We've now built 1 million homes or more under non-zero carbon standards. It will cost much more to retrofit those homes. Failing to act. This was the original insight of the Nick Stern report. Not acting costs more than acting, and the biggest debt we can leave to future generations is the costs of adapting to climate. Now, the one other thing I'd say about this, which I think is relevant and I haven't said, is there is also a global race on here around who is going to take advantage of the opportunities that climate presents. And we have been pretty useless in this country at industrial policy historically. We did some towards the end of the Labour government. Theresa May's government did a bit of it. But I think if you think about the opportunities there are, green hydrogen, we have the second highest offshore wind generation. We don't have the kind of offshore wind jobs. So I think, and Joe Biden is right about this, there's a massive jobs opportunity here too. So for all of those reasons, I think it's the right investment. And I think the imprudent, reckless thing to do is not to make the investment.
Talking about jobs, Boris Johnson plans, I think, to build 8...
To keep his job, I thought you were going to say. That's mostly what he's thinking about, I think.
I could say that, I couldn't possibly comment. He plans to build, I think, 8 nuclear reactors between now and 2030. Yeah. How many would you build?
It's sort of made up, really. This is totally made up, like most things of Boris Johnson. So the Climate Change Committee says we need 3 new nuclear power stations. That's the sort of evidence-based view. Because it's base load, it's a supporting role. It definitely plays a role in my view. But it's a supporting role to renewables. And you've got to drive forward on renewables, clean energy storage, and so on. But nuclear is part of the mix.
Okay. Last question from me before we turn over to the audience. But I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on your experience with COP.
Yeah.
We discussed it. We mentioned it a little bit earlier in Copenhagen, and really, as we look forward to Sharm el-Sheikh, what's the kind of, at a micro level, what's the sort of trick of keeping this multi-dimensional game of chess on the road? And actually, when one thinks about it, given the international context, is COP really fit for purpose anymore?
I mean, there's two things I'd say about this. One, all of the lessons I learn are that unless you have a coalition of high ambition developed countries and developing countries, you're not going to get the change you need. Why do I say that? Because the trick of Paris was to have this high ambition coalition and put pressure on countries like China and others to come along. I don't think that happened sufficiently at Glasgow. Why? Because we didn't deliver on the 100 billion, which I know President Calderon and others were talking about earlier on. And we've just got to deliver on this $100 billion that was promised at Copenhagen. I mean, it's absurd and terrible that it hasn't been delivered. But also loss and damage. And these are all difficult things. But, the thing I feel about Copenhagen most of all was that the shadow of injustice and inequality between developing and developed countries hung over that conference. And unless you have this coalition, it's not going to succeed. That's the first thing. Secondly, is COP fit for purpose? COP, it's like Churchill and democracy. It's the kind of least worst thing we have. I mean, it's essential, the COP process, but it's necessary but not sufficient. These decisions on climate have to be part of trade, and they have to be part of everything else you're doing as a government. So it is very imperfect, the COP process, but and this is a note of optimism. We are not nearly where we need to be, but we are also. We're not. David Wallace Wells, who writes about these things very well, was saying this to me in the States a month ago. We're not heading for a 4 or 5 degree world now. Is that a good thing? Well, it's like that would be, catastrophic, and 3 degrees would be catastrophic. But the fact is, countries are moving. Now, they're not moving nearly fast enough, but they are moving, and the COP process is part of that. Right. So I think, this multilateralism, it's incredibly frustrating. It's not enough on its own, but it is necessary.
Right. I don't know if we have any questions. We have a lot of questions. So maybe we can take them in threes, actually. What do you think about that? Somebody over here?
Thank you. Britain industrialized very early on and has been emitting for a long time. Do we owe the world a historic debt, and how would that inform policy?
What's your name?
Jack.
Jack, thanks.
Sorry,
Jack.
Maybe you could introduce yourself, particularly if you have any affiliation. Yeah. Sorry, I should have said that earlier.
Hi, I'm Paul van Salen, one of the co-founders of The Conduit. So welcome.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Every time I listen to you in particular, but also people who come from the same political tradition, I'm always struck by the fact that this is a no-brainer, that the melding together of both inequality and getting ourselves to net zero should be the kind of political kryptonite that just gets us overwhelmingly elected, because it's the merging together of the two great trends in our time. And yet we just did a climate disinformation podcast in which we see a disproportionate small number of people putting stuff out onto social media that is in fact muddying the water and in fact contesting public discourse around this, that is actually making it harder to win, not easier. And so my question is, why do you think people who should own the politics and the economics of this moment, this is the two things you should just win on every time, are struggling to distill down a message that just makes them electorally unassailable? Why are we not breaking through?
If I knew that, I would definitely be Prime Minister. But
I think there was one lady, just there. So, and then we'll let Ed answer. I'm taking a note of the questions. So, just in case.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a sustainability consultant and master's in economics, public policy, and innovation. So that was really interesting. And in the previous talk, people talked about political will, and I think this builds on your question. But I sometimes doubt the value of that term, because you've said that the economics works. Increasingly there's an argument. So it's a question about how useful do you think that term is in the context of climate change? And if it's not useful, then what do we need to think about instead?
Good questions. So Jack, the answer is yes. We do bear responsibility. I'd like to I want to get to net zero before 2050. It partly relates to that question of historical responsibility. This phrase that I think is still part of the climate negotiations, common but differentiated responsibilities, partly reflects that question. If you look at global emissions, historically, I think the UK is the fifth highest. Someone in the audience will correct me if I'm wrong, but fifth biggest emitter. So, we bear a lot of responsibility. On your question, Paul, so you put it very well. The way I put it is you've got to unite the concerns of the people who are worried about getting to the end of the week and the people who are worried about the end of the world. And you can, and I believe you can do that. Why don't we have good enough slogans? I don't know. I think I will make one point about this, which is, and I'm thinking a lot about this in relation to our climate investment pledge, it's got to feel tangible and real to people in their lives. So, the Biden administration wants to replace their 450,000 school buses that are petrol or diesel with electric buses. I think that's real and tangible for people. If you insulate people's homes, if you retrofit your schools, otherwise it's like I'm very interested in gigatons, but, people aren't generally talking about gigatons. So I think it's got to feel meaningful. It's got to speak to their economic concerns. That's my end of the week, end of the world thing. And then I think thirdly, and maybe slightly cautioning myself about what I said earlier, and I take your point, the lesson of Brexit is don't assume you're going to win the argument because you feel like you're right and you feel like the facts are on your side. And so, we need the right stories as well about what this actually means. I think the people are with us generally, and that's what the evidence is. But, and also we have to take fairness seriously in this. We have to take, is it fair? As somebody once said in the Brexit referendum, someone was saying, oh, GDP's up, and they said, it's your GDP, not my GDP. In other words, how does it affect me? On the question about, the good question about political will, I think political will is sort of important in this. And I suppose it relates to the previous question, which is it's got to speak to people's, what is the most difficult democratic challenge of climate? It's that the decisions we take now will have their biggest impact in generations' time. That isn't to say that climate change isn't real or isn't here at the moment. Of course it is, but decisions now, because of the time carbon stays up in the atmosphere, will have their biggest implications 40, 50, 100 years hence. Now, so what's the answer to that? You've got to combine it with tackling the current injustices that people face. If you say, sorry, these injustices that you worry about in your lives now are going to have to wait or might become worse because we've got to tackle this other thing, you're not going to take people with you. If you say we can do both together, which I absolutely believe we can, because if we change the way we heat our homes, travel around, use our land, of course we can make better lives for people. And actually, I think part of our thing in the climate movement, we're in the better lives business. We're in the better lives now business. I think we've got to have that conviction. We're not in the, things are going to be really kind of worse for you, but honestly, it's good for future generations. I don't believe that's our pitch. And I'm not saying that because I want to politically win the argument. I'm saying it because I think I do want to politically win the argument. I'm saying it because I think it's true.
Any more questions? A few over there. Two at least.
Hi, thank you. I'm Safia. Me and my colleague Annie represent the UK Youth Delegation to the G7. And we were very disappointed, unfortunately, with the outcomes of the G7 this year and its failure to reflect youth views and ambition and particularly climate justice and how it kind of intersects with racial justice, gender equality and the views of young people. And I was just wondering, on your point on multilateralism, whether you do see tangible spaces for that diversity of views and for it to have an impact at that high-level decision-making, particularly when it comes to the views of marginalised communities.
Good question.
I think there's another one. Yes? Maybe that.
Hi, yes, I'm Annie, and I also am a manager at C40 Cities, so unsurprisingly my question is about cities. And how can governments better learn from other levels of government? For example, you spoke about climate change needed to be integrated into the financial budget. This has already been happening in Oslo. It's been happening since 2017. And 12 other cities are working on a pilot right now, including London, to do the same. So how can we fast-track that learning to national government? Thanks.
We've got one more. We can do it in this round. Sorry, I'm ignoring this type of...
Hi.
G'day, Ed.
G'day.
So what do you see the role of really kind of investing in really radical technological innovation for climate change in terms of government doing that? So you were talking about how the cost of
Yeah.
wind power is a quarter of that of gas. And so where do you see...
Is that your area that you work in?
Yes, I'm a tech for good entrepreneur.
What's your answer to the question? You'll give a better answer than me, probably.
Yes, there needs to be tons of very focused money on radical climate solutions, like some of the ones that were talked about earlier on. So
Is this about how you manage demand in the system, or is it about other? Is it? What would you say a bit more?
well, I mean, thinking about kind of very ambitious kind of, venture capital models, or, that have resulted in, for instance, the radical changes that have happened with electric cars globally. If you target the money well and with a mission, you can have really dramatic, global impact. So
Okay.
I'm just wondering
Okay,
what your thinking is about
That's
that.
a good question. On young people, I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, sort of after this session. I mean, I'm thinking about this new department. How do you integrate the voice of young people into your decision making better than many institutions do? But I do want to say, I think the people climate strikers, Greta, all that. I mean, it's definitely had an impact on the debate. Sometimes it's hard to think that the debate has moved, but the debate has moved, and I think politicians, nothing concentrates the mind like voters and potential voters, and I think that has, I think it just has had an impact. But I think you're right that we've got to do better at integrating that into our thinking, and I'd love to hear from you about how we do that. On cities, I think you're also correct to say this. I think there's two ways in which you're correct to say it. One, we should learn from cities. Debate is far too parochial in the UK, not just about learning from other countries, but learning from what's happening in the UK. And your point about London is well taken. But the other thing is that we can't deliver all in the UK context. We can't deliver all this from Whitehall. If you think about insulating homes, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, both Stephen and I are too young to remember this. Britain transitioned from town gas to natural gas. It was a house by house, street by street transition. That can't be driven from me in Whitehall. It's going to have to be driven locally by cities. C40 does a brilliant job on showcasing what cities are doing. But so you're 100% right about this. And one of the optimistic things is that whatever Biden's challenges, I know that cities and states in the US are driving this forward. Your technology point, again, is well taken. Just in the sort of spirit of openness, I mean, one of the things I'm also thinking about, and it relates to, I'm also thinking about in relation to this new department, is if you're a politician, making the decisions about what is the right way to invest the public resources is a really hard thing, because you get people coming at you saying hydrogen's the answer, heat pumps are the answer, this is the answer, tidal power is the answer, and so on. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is how do you integrate scientific understanding? David did a brilliant job of this in government. How do you integrate scientific understanding at the heart of your decision making so it's not so capricious? I think a lot of government decision making strikes me as very, very capricious. Stephen mentioned this. Suddenly Boris Johnson, okay, he's an extreme example, I agree, but he's suddenly wanted a nuclear power station a year. He just sort of made it up because it sounded good. Now I'm not saying it's sort of what they call, I think, policy-based evidence making rather than evidence-based policy making. But so I think technology is obviously a key part of this.
Okay, we've got a minute and a half. So if anybody has
I was sprinting through
very
so I could
quick final questions, or
I think there's one over there.
Okay, so.
Oh, okay. I don't think it's a very good question. Sorry that we're going to end on this. I would just say one chink in the armour could possibly be meat consumption in the form of bacon butty.
Yes, that's a good point. No one's ever made that joke before.
Sorry. And the question was, just going back to...
Actually, I had this idea, because, so for those who don't know, and if you don't know, I'm really pleased. I famously ate a bacon sandwich, I know you all know. And I was talking to Lord Deben about this, because he famously fed his daughter a beef burger. When there were mad cow disease. So I was thinking he and I could be the sort of public engagement of saying, here are vegetarian options. I could do the bacon sandwich and he could do the beef burger. Anyway.
Amazing. So my name's Holly. I'm from Hubbub Foundation, and we're a behaviour change environmental charity. My question is slightly based on Sir David's science, in that I think we've been focusing on heating a lot in this conversation about insulating the UK.
Yeah.
And Sir David mentioned sort of jet stream fluctuations that created a situation in a town in Canada that had a result where 135 people died because
This is
of
the dome. This is the
extreme heating event.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know, I guess this ties into the previous question about this kind of black swan event planning and what are we doing instead of just focusing on heating our homes, how are we also preparing for random heating, flooding events?
So this is being done very, very badly in the UK. I mean, this is like, I'm really glad you asked this question, because this is definitely the sort of the poorest of poor relations when it comes, and it's because it's exactly the black swan thing. I mean, adaptation, you know, as the Climate Change Committee looks at what the government is doing, they're pretty critical of a lot of things. The adaptation thing is sort of disastrous. It's stuck in this department, for those who don't know, called DEFRA, and it's sort of, you know, it's just, you know, we're going to have to take it much, much more seriously. And the reason is, it's an interesting insight into politics. It's because these are extreme but infrequent events, and so basically people just ignore them until they happen, and then everybody complains, says it's terrible, and then sort of in a goldfish mentality, everybody forgets about them and carries on. So, you know, yes, mitigation is absolutely crucial, but we have to take adaptation a lot more seriously, and we have to take investment into adaptation. And you know, I was on a, I'll just say this anecdote, I was on a train accidentally, if you can put it this way, with the Governor of the Bank of England the other day. We were both on the last train back from Doncaster, and suddenly it was quite a hot day, and it was like we got stuck for half an hour, 45 minutes, because the track had warped, because it was too hot. And, you know, that is a very British event, the wrong type of heat. But, you know, we've got to take it, you know, it's got to be taken a lot, you know, sadly, it's going to have to be taken much more seriously, because we are not a country which is currently equipped for those extreme weather events.
Time is up. I'm afraid it is time for Ed Miliband to get back on his bike, go on and eat his vegetarian life.
Exactly.
I, for once, found that really fascinating. Thank you very much for giving out
Thank you
your
very much.
Saturday morning.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Stephen.